Welcome Internet. Today we're going to be talking about a phenomenon that is very interesting and that I have thought a lot about. This phenomena is the last minute revelations in a session. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that moment in which the patient says something which he hasn't referenced during the session, which he has not talked about, which comes out of left field, yet is very important. So the nature of the revelation, right, can be very, very different. It can go from the death of a relative to substance abuse, through trauma, rape, incest, and so on and so forth. So it's during the very last moments of the session, when things are wrapping up, when you have scheduled another appointment, that the person feels comfortable enough to say something like, this happened to me, or this has occurred. So I found it very interesting, as during the length of the session, as I was saying earlier, the patient could have verbalized it. They could have said, wait, I have something I need to talk about. I want to talk about this, but they've spent the session talking about something else, which sometimes is as important, right? It's not like a value judgment of good and bad. It's more like they've spent the session talking about something else. And at the very, very end, like the tail end, in which the session can't go on any longer because the hour has gone, right? Or is finished. They give you this, in a way, this very important aspect of themselves. This event that they haven't even graced during the session, i.e. they haven't talked about it. So I have come to think a lot about it, as it doesn't happen frequently, but it also is not rare per se. I.e., I would say if I had to count it, I'd say it happens at least once every 2 months. So in like, let's say 8 sessions a day, 5 days a week, it's not common, right? It's not everyone, it's not all the time. But when it happens, it always questions me. I'm like, this is interesting. Why did the patient feel that way? And this video is basically me trying to unravel the mystery behind it. Well, I think that first and foremost, sometimes last minute revelations, are they because the patient does not necessarily want to talk about it, at least not now. It's a bit like, I think, dropping a seed, right? You're dropping the the phenomena with the therapist, but you're not going to talk about it. You're, in a way, paving the road to the next session, because at least what I do is often I start by saying, remember when we left off last session, you told me this, and we can pick up from there. So I think that it also has to do with my way of doing things, but if we were to think about it, what is happening is the patient is planting the seed of the next session, i.e. it's a bit like a gestation, that it stays within the compounds of the session, but it's not addressed directly. So it becomes a phenomena in which both the patient and the therapist think about it. Like, oh, they told me this is important, this is valuable. And often it's, a moment in which both therapist and patient think about it. Often, sometimes you also create a projection. What I mean by that as a therapist is that, for example, because you don't have all the details, you're like, oh, this happened, so it must have been like this and like that with this type of person in this type of setting, and so on and so forth. So you create a form of fantasy, i.e. a subjective construct on what has occurred, but you don't know. And that's very interesting because you're already laying something in your mind or what's going to happen. So often, for those patients, once you reach the next session, in which they often talk about it in a much more, explicit way. As I said, the plant the seed that was put there has grown even for them. It also gives us a form of psychic relevance to the topic and brings it into existence, as dropping it is a way of not confronting the event directly, but to just make it exist, just the spark of it. but it's not the time for the spark to grow. It's not the time for the seed to grow into a plant. That's the work of this next session, but also all the time between the sessions. Even if you have only a day between the two sessions, or a week, or a month, or what have you, but that time is both an important moment for the therapist and for the patient to build upon it. And the patient knows by verbalizing it that it's going to be addressed. It's not going to stand there just empty. It's going to have a certain form of elaboration. Also, I think that perhaps in case of traumatic events, what is very important for the patient is perhaps also to share the experience of trauma, i.e. that surprise, that shock that comes in. Is often something to, at least I feel as a therapist, when a patient just says something on the edge of the door, like they open the door and say, oh, and this happened, and then they leave. A form of shock, which I think is a form of projective identification towards a therapist, so that the therapist can receive, handle, digest during the interspace between both sessions and the intertime between both sessions, in order to restitute it to the patient, i.e. the therapist is taking care of that seed that has been implemented within the psyche, right? So basically the patient might be running away from the revelation, that they throw it as a bomb and it's contained within the setting of the therapist, and something that's going to be diffused in next session, i.e. they're getting rid of something that's intolerable or that is frightening, and they're giving it to the therapist. It's like, you handle it until next session. So the big question is, why didn't they want to talk about it during the session? Why does it have to be a last minute revelation? Well, I think that they basically do not want to talk about it because it might still not be the right time. And I think this is very important, because we tend to forget that as therapists, that everything happens in due time. You can't force the psyche or the mind to just be on the go, to just come out like that. Trauma and traumatic events, or loss or grief, all of that have a very specific timing, which is completely ego relative, but the idea is that it's idiosyncratic, i.e. it's very specific to each individual, very subjective, and we don't know from the get-go. So they might need also a time, even though they might know the therapist for a long time, they might still need an extra session that's a buffer, a way of seeing if the therapist is ready to receive that. And that last minute revelation is a way of sending it off. Perhaps also by fear that if there was a whole session about it, it would break them, but maybe perhaps the therapist. And throwing it out at the very last minute is a way of protecting both themselves and their psyche and the therapist. So it's not necessarily just a projective identification, I was saying, but sometimes it's also a way of basically safeguarding both themselves and the therapist. So it can be very important for them to do those last minute revelations. I should also add, and this is important as well, that I don't think it's necessarily psychopathologically binded. What I mean by that is that it's not necessarily like psychotic patients that do it, it's not necessarily neurotic patients, it's a bit of everyone that can have this form of last minute revelation. And I think it's for areas in which the psyche is not yet ready. It's not ready, but it needs to just put something there to go back to. A way of, how I see it is that it's the first step or the first stone in a home. It's there and it's basically going to be addressed, but not right now. I should also say that sometimes I think that those last minute revelations can be a way of basically creating the event in a psychic way. What I mean by that is that the event that is destructive in the mind, for example, the trauma, is going to break the mind. Therefore, the mind is going to reject it. By doing that last minute revelation, what is happening is that they're creating something. They're creating a potential for it to be open, for it to be transformed, but at the very last minute, so that they can just basically have a space of potentiality, that it doesn't need to be actualized right now, but it's the potential that makes it so important. The potential in which the therapist will hold to this idea until the next session, until the next moment where the patient is ready to talk about it. Also, and this is very important, I don't think it's a bad thing, those last minute revelations. I think if the patient uses them, is it because they can't handle them in any other way? In this case scenario, I think that it's also the duty of the therapist to accept it. Not necessarily if the hour has stopped to continue the hour. That I think is not necessarily good or necessary, especially because it beats the point of those last minute revelations. And if they have meaning, as I'm trying to elaborate in this video, it might even be counterproductive to try and force a patient to just stay there and elaborate on it when they're not ready. So again, I don't think that they're bad things. I think they're very interesting. And they show perhaps a moment of weakness in terms of the psyche, in terms of the fact that the psyche can't handle it. Again, weakness not being any moral failure, right? It's just the mind might not be explicitly ready for it, so it's very important for it to just be there as a snapshot, as almost perhaps very importantly, as a moment of light in darkness. That it's not ready for switching on right now, but it's ready to be shown. And that showing is already very important, very essential, because it gives an existence to the phenomena, to the trauma. So basically, this is pretty much my position on these last minute revelations, which I find, and I've always found them to be so very interesting, because they show the complexity of human nature and how we react, both as therapists and as patients. A moment of dialectic, especially because it's during those basically in-between moments. In French would say moment interstitiel, meaning between the end and basically leaving the office. There's very specific moments which are so very rich because they're not a formal session. We're no longer just patient therapist with two people saying goodbye. And I think it's also that sometimes sparks it, is that goodbye is and that last minute revelation can be a forget me not, right? As the flower, right? The don't forget about me between the sessions, right? So it can be a bit like that. And of course, certain patients just love extending the time of their session, but it's last minute revelations aren't necessarily that. People can just give it and then leave. Completely like, we're done, I don't want to hear about this session or today, let's do it next time. And basically, it's very different for everyone. But I always find it so fascinating. So that's pretty much it for last minute revelations and my opinion on them. If you have anything to add, feel free to do it in the comments. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.